Welcome back to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. On this week's episode, we have a guest host, so please be the same respectful audience you are for me and enjoy. In the world of medicine, where every decision can change lives, your peace of mind is crucial. This is where Pattern steps in. Imagine insurance made simple, fast, and personalized, just for you. With Pattern, you're not just getting disability and life insurance, you're insuring your future and protecting your greatest asset, your income. In the past 10 years, Pattern has transformed the way over 20,000 doctors secure their financial well-being. Discover the simplicity of securing your future at patternlife.com or click the link in the description.
Hello, this is your guest host, Dr. Amna Shabbir, and in today's episode, I interview seasoned psychiatrist Dr. Ashok Bhattacharya on the topic of empathy, a word you were taught, hear everywhere, but may not fully integrate in your life. Empathy is a teachable skill that can be an ultimate form of self-care. So listen in.
Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. Today I am very excited to announce our guest who is with us. I will be talking to Dr. Ashok Bhattacharya. He is the founder of the Empathy Clinic. He trained as a psychiatrist and specializes in psychotherapy for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. His practice emphasizes empathy individually and in relationships, whether they be at home or in the workplace. After 38 years in private practice, he's trying to get the message to more people. Empathy is a teachable skill. Welcome, Ashok. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Anna. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm excited to have the conversation we're about to have.
Absolutely. So empathy is a word that we hear a lot. It is thrown around quite a bit. And I want to ask you, what drew you to empathy in specific? Because this is something I started learning it the first time I entered medical school. What drew you to empathy in specific and to the point that you actually have your clinic and just focuses on empathy?
Well, I started to think about empathy, this is true, when I was about 8 years of age. And I started to think about how I perceive the world, how I think about the world, and how I feel about the world. But how does everything else think and feel about the world? So if I look at the color green and it looks green to me, I actually have no idea how it looks to somebody else. Because as long as someone points to that color and says, that's green, we don't know how the other person sees it because we're not in their eyes using their chromatophores to see the way they see that color. And that began to really upset me. Like, I don't know how other people see green. I got thinking, well, maybe everything else is like that. How do other people experience what they experience? And then when I became a doctor, and certainly when I became a psychiatrist, I realized it's all about thinking about how somebody else experiences their experiences. When someone comes to us, whether they're in pain or suffering or distress or anxiety, etc., we know how we may feel in those situations, but the key for empathy is how do they feel in that situation as them?
That's a great way to phrase it. And I love that analogy that you use because I never thought of it before. How are they seeing the color green? How are we perceiving things? So when we think about how other people are feeling, and as healers, as physicians, and yourself as a psychiatrist, this is very, very closely tied. Now, jumping forward, if you look at this core skill, how do you think that we might be dropping the ball on empathy despite being told, like, walking in someone's shoes, trying to understand what they are thinking, what they are feeling, what they're experiencing? How might we be dropping the ball when it comes to empathy for each other? That's one. And then maybe for even our patients.
Okay, well, first of all, empathy is not walking in somebody else's shoes. That is you in their shoes. That's closer to sympathy. How you experience somebody else's experience is your experience of their experience. It's not their experience of their experience. And I think that leads into hopefully an answer to what you asked. If you think you have to get into somebody else's experience to understand them, it's a lot of work. It also might be draining, and it might cause you what's called compassion fatigue. If you see empathy as simply taking information, perspective taking, you don't have to do anything about it necessarily, then that relieves you of all that potential anxiety and grief and shame and guilt that, I did do something, instead you're just taking perspective. And I think when we put empathy in the right place and have a boundary around empathy as well, it becomes doable and it becomes also teachable as well.
I would like to explore that a bit more, having a boundary around empathy. And I'm glad that you pointed out about the walking in someone else's shoes, because it does sound very exhausting. And one of the symptoms I experienced when I was going through burnout was I just felt spent when I would come home at the end of the day because I cared so much. And then I just didn't have anything left to give to my family or left to give to myself. So when we talk about drawing that line, like, how do you draw that line?
Well, without getting too lectury, I think burnout and PTSD are empathy disorders. And if someone has a traumatic event that they can't imagine anybody else believing, the quantity, the size, the emotionality of the event, they feel alienated and isolated. And what I do in my clinic is I empathize with that person's trauma. So now finally they have someone who appreciates and understands their story. That's sometimes the first time they've ever felt not alone with that story. Burnout, and this is probably a bit of a jump, burnout is a deficiency of self-empathy. So self-empathy is the capacity to get outside of yourself and look at yourself from an objective point of view, not as you, but almost like what would you tell a friend in that situation. And when people get burnt out, they start to feel shame and guilt and disappointment and low confidence, self-esteem. They're now in a prison of self-incriminating thinking. And eventually, of course, there's compassion fatigue and anxiety, sometimes even depression and more after that. So it's about always having enough space to be able to get outside of yourself and look at. And if you want an analogy, it's like when you go on a vacation and you come back, you're actually outside of your life. And you come back to your life and you can say, oh, we could do this differently and we can do that differently. And that space gives you an opportunity to take inventory, rearrange, and optimize your physical and mental health.
Very interesting. As I come back from vacation and listen to it,
Right?
I definitely am taking inventory. Where do you place moral injury in all of this if we talk about self-empathy, burnout, healthcare workers, and you've been practicing for almost 4 decades now. So where do you place all of moral injury in this?
Well, most people I know who want to become doctors or are doctors or are in the healthcare profession or in the helping professions, and I would include even firefighters and police and paramedics and that genre of people, they start out with the ideal of wanting to help people. That's the ideal. I want to help people. And if you want to make tons and tons of money, be a business person or be a .com person. But if you want to help people, being a doctor is such an amazing opportunity to help people, not just people who, yeah, sure, thanks. It's people who are in dire need, frightened, illness, sickness, facing death, all kinds of stuff. So that's the ideal. And I think the moral injury begins to happen when helping people becomes, oh my gosh, am I helping enough people? Are they getting better? Are they appreciating me? Am I getting complaints? Am I now facing legal issues? Am I even looking after my self-care? I feel tired. I haven't peed in 12 hours, et cetera, et cetera. So that can accumulate to the point of, what am I doing? Am I actually helping people? And as the yellow mask gets further and further from your face, like in the airplane when the yellow mask is supposed to put in yourself, as that goes further, you start to lose emotional oxygen, and now that moral injury is top high.
That plane analogy was interesting. The oxygen mask is moving away from you. So what do you think would be a good way for healthcare workers and physicians in specific, or pretty much everyone in healthcare, because since we touched on empathy, and we are really, all of us are giving from an empty cup. We're pouring with nothing to give. Where would you plug in empathy right now? If I had to ask you, say, what would be step 1 for healing with empathy?
Let's just get even more basic. Let's talk about time management. So when I went to medical school between 1980 and 1984, I didn't hear one sentence about how to manage your time as a physician. And if we talk about self-care, so your self-care is maybe an hour a day, maybe 3 hours a week, maybe more. If your self-care is non-negotiable, and that's what you have to do to be able to do your job properly, then you put that in the calendar first, and other things get put around it. What happens with a lot of physicians, and you know this because you teach in your new graduates, is that as soon as you graduate, you've got debt, you've got anxiety, you want to get a great job, you want to work as hard as you can to build a reputation, and you stand back from that 3 or 4 years later, and you haven't put any space in for self-care. Where's my self-care? You might be doing well, you might be getting so busy that everyone wants a piece of your time, and you haven't looked after your time. So that's a simpler answer. I think we have to think of the non-negotiability of self-care like that yellow oxygen mask on the airplane. So that's self-empathy first. And I think that empathy is a bit inconvenient because you have to make space and time for it. And one of the things that blocks empathy for all of us is pain. If you have a really bad toothache or headache or you're going through some stress, you're not going to be as empathic than if you're calm, centered, you've done some breath meditation, you have bandwidth to be able to cope with somebody else's experiences, particularly if they're suffering.
That is a very interesting and important point, because if we were to make this a non-negotiable, we had to add it, because I was reading the Nagoski sisters' book, Burnout, in which they quote the statistics that 42% of your day has to be rest. And that comes up to about 10 hours, which includes sleep, it includes rest, it includes talking to somebody you love or gives you joy, and other activities such as exercise. Are we getting that 42%? And I love the quote in that book, I'm paraphrasing, that if you don't take that time out, the 42% will put you on the floor, stand on your chest, and claim itself the victor, because that's what we think. We think that this is nice and good to learn, but doesn't apply to me. But it is so relevant, as you've said.
Well, just to simplify, stress, too much stress kills us. Not enough stress makes us kind of blobby and less effective. But the right stress, the use stress, makes us functional and also optimizes us. And the problem with burnout, and especially in physicians, is they often don't realize that they're stressed until it's been going on for a little bit too long, and they're getting a divorce, or their practice is falling apart, or there's a complaint against them, and they're saying, oh my gosh. When you do the look back over the months or the years prior to that, you can often see the red flags showing up. Like self-care red flags, things as simple as sleep, poor habits, lack of exercise, no time for social life, traveling, that kind of stuff. So are these things preventable? I think they totally are. But I'm going to be a bit pedantic, they have to be taught when we're learning the trade of medicine. I learned a lot about pheochromocytoma. I never saw one, but I didn't get told anything about self-care.
You said self-empathy is inconvenient. Can you expand a little bit more on that? Because it is.
Empathy by itself is somewhat inconvenient because it takes a little extra time. But that little extra time saves immeasurable time down the road. And I think to be able to stop, take some breaths, take inventory of yourself, and ask yourself that simple, deep question, how are you doing? Is there something getting in the way of making you feel good about yourself? Is there something dragging you down? Is there something that if you could change, you would, and you could, that would make your life right now a better place? Now, these are simple questions that we ask our patients. But why do we ask that of ourselves on a regular basis so that when we're driving to work, we're ready and we're fired up and we're energized, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I forgot to take inventory and I hope I make it through the day. Burnout is ubiquitous. Anything that overstresses us can burn us out. I could say motherhood burns out women, and we don't talk about that. We talk about postpartum depression. We don't talk about it as from a burnout perspective, when many of the signs and symptoms of that are quite similar.
It's almost that it's more convenient and acceptable to talk about other things than those really specific points.
It's the end of another busy day. You just saw 20, 30 patients, maybe more. Instead of heading home for dinner with your spouse or playing with your kids, you now begin your night job, charting. Charting is critical for patient care, billing, and medical legal liability, but it steals our focus from our patients, eats away at our time with our families, and keeps us up at night. The burden of always having another chart to complete drains all of us. Freed listens, prepares your notes, and writes patient instructions for you. Charting is done before your patient walks out of the room. Wait, because it gets better. Freed learns your style over time. It's AI, just like a human scribe would, except it will never quit on you. Freed is loved by 3,000 plus clinicians from every specialty. It's HIPAA compliant, takes 30 seconds to learn, and costs only $99 a month. You can try Freed for free right now by going to freed.ai, Freed.ai. Listeners of the Physician's Guide to Doctoring can use the code PGD50 for $50 off the first month.
Earlier, you also mentioned about drawing a boundary surrounding empathy, and I really want to expand on that further as well, because what do I do? For example, I have a full day of clinic, seen 26 patients almost, and there's been a lot of electronic messages from patients as well that I've taken care of. And I'm sharing an example of a primary care day, for example. And I've also done a lot of paperwork. And how do I not become a shell of a person when I walk through and cross the threshold and enter my house? And where can I plug in that boundary?
Well, I think that boundary has to be there most of the time. And I look at empathy boundaries the way I look at a house. If you have a house, you have windows and doors. And that means that you have a place you can open and you can close it. You can have a window, you can look out and say, oh, do I want to deal with that? Okay, I went. Or no, maybe I'm going to assign that to somebody else because I'm just a little bit tapped out right here. I think that sometimes is not always feasible, like in a busy emergency room or a busy practice. So I think we also have to have what I would call the rental of future experience. And that means that you have to have an experience in your future, like an amazing trip to Europe, like you just had, to say, okay, I need to get through this because when I get through this, I'll be able to do this later on. And when we can borrow those empathic spaces from other places in our experience, it can fortify us with hope. And I think of soldiers going to war, they're going to be there for 6 years. They have no idea when it's going to end. They're not sure if they're going to survive it. They had a picture in their wallet of someone they loved or a place they'd love to be or a dream that they come back to. So we can't always have something in the immediate space, but we can have something that we can look forward to, that we can import in that space to give us just enough fortification we can get to that moment.
So we're ideating and aspiring and sort of almost indulging in some daydreaming.
Absolutely. And I think anyone who does any endurance activities, like I'm not an athlete, but I've done lots of endurance athletic activities, like 9-hour bike rides for hundreds of kilometers. Halfway through, you're kind of done. But I think, well, I sit in my office for 9 hours. It's just pretend I'm there. Okay, my backside is hurting because I'm sitting on a bike, but just think about the hot shower I'm going to have later on. I'm using an idea of future comfort to be able to get through it. And I think, just to be a bit mean, being a doctor and going through medical school is an endurance test. It's not just how smart you are or how much you know. It's an endurance test. And getting out in your practice is an endurance test. So you have to have things in place that fortify your resilience and your endurance. And I'm going to say this, you got to have fun. Got to have fun in your life because that's a huge part of what gives us joy.
For sure. And I feel like you have to block out the time as well, just for the fun and for the dreaming, and take inventory. It's almost like just stop and pause and breathe and just see what's happening. If it's too much, it needs to be, a lot of things need to be said no to, a lot of things need to be removed, and things need to be reorganized, rather than going home every day feeling like I was describing that I just don't have capacity for anything, including myself, let alone another family member. Just pivoting a little bit, now we're talking about patients that we care for, and we're there. How do you incorporate and teach empathy to your patients and individuals? Like, how is that a tool that we can use to help our patients better?
Well, I'm constantly spending any opportunity I can get with anybody to explain empathy and teach it. And when I have someone in my practice who maybe they're a bit of an insensitive person, maybe they're a little bit on the narcissistic spectrum, maybe it's all about them, maybe they see me and they're complaining about them, I make it quite a deliberate point of asking them how the other people in their world are doing. And then ask them to investigate that. And then say, well, I don't know, or I've never asked. And it's about, well, let's ask. Let's imagine that. Let's put our minds together. And sometimes, and I'm a big fan of couples therapy, and I do that quite a lot as well, that's a great opportunity to say to one partner, what do you think your partner's feeling right now? And ask that to each of them. And they'll say, I don't know. I said, well, ask. Just ask. And I think when we start teaching otherness, which is here I am, I'm in my mind, I'm in my heart, I'm in my soul, how does that other person think and feel? Not surprisingly, when people practice otherness, they feel stronger, more fortified in themselves. Because human beings ultimately are a social creature. We have to connect with each other. And one of the biggest dopamine hits that we get is being helpful to somebody. Isn't that cool? So by being helpful, inquiring, just asking, how are you doing today? And if there's something I can do to make your day better, let me know. That actually makes people feel lighter, fortified. And that's the reason why we became doctors, right? To make people feel better.
Absolutely. It almost reminds me of the 3 core components of self-compassion as Dr. Neff describes it. And, plugging in common humanity over there and the ability to recognize the shared human experience that we are all going through, and a lot of perspective taking in there.
Yeah, I think when we forget we're all the same species, and when we forget that we all have issues and troubles, and when we forget that what you see is not necessarily what someone's going through on the inside, we can start to get that kind of alienated and cold feeling towards each other. I'm always diving in the opposite direction. I will ask someone a personal question on first meeting, once I've created a sense of safety, of course. And what I've learned over decades of doing this is people are very ready to share something with you if you create the right space. And I call that a listening space.
A listening space. And today is probably one of those moments in which I think the creating otherness is taken in a positive light because, otherwise the word can be used in a whole different manner as well. So now we're doing perspective taking. We're asking other people how they feel. We're also, to reflect back on what you said earlier, creating a non-negotiable time for self-care and delving into self-empathy. What else, if you were to look as wisdom from your decades of practice, thoughts that come up for you if you were to say, I wish I could tell a couple of years earlier when you were in medical training, or, we had an earlier conversation in which you talked about some touch of burnout and situation that have happened earlier in your life. What would you tell that younger person?
Well, I would say a few things. One, I would say is always make room for yourself. Always have a hobby. I'm a big fan of having a hobby, not just to have a hobby, but to have the time and space to have a hobby. Because our brains need to go from the left and the right, and also the back and forth. We need brain fitness. And looking after your brain means that you do things that are decidedly different than the things that you do all the time. Otherwise, if you get repetitive strain injury from a finger, you can get it in your mind as well. So do something different. And also, and this is going to sound a bit glib, but things generally work out. Believe that. And when you believe that, it's amazing how things do generally work out. So I believe in what Seligman would call realistic hopefulness and optimism. And I've always been a terribly optimistic person. But you know what? It's a lot better than being pessimistic, because pessimism causes a lot of misery. And burnout is a mindset of pessimism. And if we can begin to steer that towards some optimism and find it and grasp it, embrace it, put it in the heart, then tomorrow's going to feel a little bit better. And just keep pulling on that optimistic rope, I think, can get you out of the pit of that pessimistic place.
Let's stay there for a second, Ashok, because I was that person. And now I do also will say I identify myself as a terribly optimistic human, and I'm very grateful for that natural alignment and a lot of, I think, consciously created atmosphere surrounding it from my early teens. But when you talk about, this is where burnout, and when we talk about these things, the physician especially will feel gaslit. Like, you're telling me to be more hopeful. You're telling me to be more optimistic. How can I do that right now? I'm working so much. There's no space for me. When I'm talking to, leadership and people in my institute, like, no one's listening to me. I was that person when I would see people to go from somebody who's very optimistic to then become so tired, exhausted, depleted. Now, thinking of that human, what would be, I would say, a bridge thought to then go forward towards a more happier place?
Well, I'm just going to be a little bit disruptive to the style of our meeting right now. And I think that burnout is not an individual issue, it's a systemic issue.
Yes.
So it's not just the individual that has to learn to be more resilient and be tougher and have a thicker skin. Otherwise, you're going to have a skin a foot long deep. it has to be systemic. And what I'm really hoping, and this is a put to you, is that leaders like you will begin to change the culture of corporate medicine. And I'm meeting more and more people like you who are, I call you champions of the future, because we have to change that. When I got into medicine, it was mean, it was shame-based, you got yelled at often. If you made a mistake, you were humiliated. If you did something right, no one mentioned it, and people took credit often. That's changed. That's changed quite a bit now, but we need to keep changing it. And the hope I have for the future is that just like we got corporal punishment out of the schools in the 60s and 70s, we can get corporate meanness out of the culture of medicine.
Corporate meanness.
I don't want people thinking that, oh, I have to change, because sometimes there are just toxic cultures. And sometimes people have to move on. I'm extremely lucky because I was able to set up a private practice and run my own show since I was 29 years of age. So I've not worked in a lot of the systems that are soul crushing. And I think I knew I couldn't survive. No, I kind of built my own little place, built my own little kingdom, invited all these lovely people in there. And I cringe at what would have happened to me had I gone into sort of more managed care practice. I just wouldn't have survived it. So I knew my limitations early on. And maybe that's a good talking point right there. People need to know their limitations as well as their strengths. And when you work in concert with what you're good at, and what you need to be careful at, and what you have an anaphylactic reaction to, then you don't get, the wrong peanut in your mouth. And then now you're the problem instead of being able to put your best optimal energies forward.
So the inventory that you did and the assessment that you did in your 20s allowed you to have longevity and this wonderful career, which you have created for yourself, is another, I would say, testament to self-empathy.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
As we wrap up today, and I so appreciate your time, what are 3, I would say, pearls of wisdom that you want to leave physicians listening with in terms of empathy? It could be self-empathy, empathy for patients, empathy for other team members.
I'm going to leave you with a general idea. I meet with a group once a month of like-minded physicians and therapists, and we talk and we share cases. But what we mostly do is we gripe and whinge and complain and soothe each other. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really useful when physicians and healthcare workers are honest with each other about what they're going through. It's really, really helpful when somebody else says, I'm going through the same thing, because that combats that sense of aloneness. It's really helpful when it says, well, I tried this, and you hadn't even thought of that, because your brain is just being hijacked by stress and compassion fatigue. Then you're sharing. So I would really recommend that physicians start talking to each other, sharing the aches and pains, and also making sure that if someone just needs to go out for a dinner date, have a coffee, and just feel a soft hand on a shoulder. It just warms up that shoulder so much. We cannot give each other a cold shoulder. We can warm our shoulders.
That was so powerful. I have nothing to add to that. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, for your time. I will put in the link, the show notes, where folks can find you and connect with you and learn more about the resources that you share and the work that you do. Thank you, Ashok.
It's been my honor to speak with you, Amna.
Doctors dedicate our lives to caring for others. It's time someone took care of us. Visit patternlife.com to simplify your path to peace of mind. Patternlife.com, simplifying your insurance journey. Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thanks again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.